Hey guys, this week we're talking about communion offering, and this is something most of us regularly participate in. So the point of today's video isn't to talk about what's the proper way to do it, whether you should, take communion once a week or once a month. That's a discussion for a completely different day, and I would suggest that none of those ways are inherently wrong. But the point of today's video is to talk about why we do these things, lest they become just pointless traditions, because we have to understand these things. So I just want to take today to explain why we do these things. First is communion, and arguably the more important of the two. And communion is often seen today as, taking some bread or a communion wafer, or taking some wine or some grape juice, whatever your church does, and partaking of them together as a body of Christ. And we see this rooted back into the New Testament, often seen as breaking bread. And we see this in places like Acts 27, when Paul's come by to Troas and he's preaching to them on the first day of the week, aka Sunday, that they usually break bread, that this was a usual occurrence for them. This acts as a model for churches today. This is the reason why we often do communion on Sundays during service. So this is something that the early church did regularly on this specific day. So this is why we do it on Sundays. But the first instance of this can be traced back to Jesus in Matthew 16:26-29. Now Jesus here breaks some bread, hands it around to his disciples, and is like, "Take, eat. This is my body." And then he takes some wine, passes it around, says, "Take, drink. This is my blood." See, this bread represents his body that was broken, and the blood represents his blood that was spilled, because this is the Last Supper. This is right before he gets captured by the Romans and then eventually crucified. That this Last Supper, that this presidency that he sets, that we now call communion, is a remembrance of his sacrifice on the cross. And this is further supported by Paul in 1 Corinthians 11:17-34, because Paul asserts that when we partake in communion, we proclaim the Lord's death until the day he returns. So this becomes a very bittersweet thing, that we are proclaiming Jesus' death, right? The suffering that he went through. But at the same time, we are joyous that we have had victory over sin as a result of his death, that we are reconciled to God. And Paul, in this passage, also does present a very firm warning against taking communion lightly, because there's a problem in the Corinthian church. There's a reason why he's bringing it up to them, because they've been having problems with this, because it's been very first come first serve. The first people come by, they take all the food, they're getting drunk off the wine, and then the last people come by and there's nothing left for them. They're going hungry. And so this isn't right. Paul says, no, all of you should be getting some. Take it all together, make sure nobody is left without. Don't have the first people that come by take it all, and then the people at the end have nothing left. No, have everybody have some, and then take it together. But he also gives a very important and very concerning warning against them. And Paul suggests that when they take communion, they should examine themselves. That those who partake communion improperly take guilt and judgment upon themselves. That with that eating and that drinking, they're taking upon themselves guilt and judgment when they're not taking it properly, when they're not examining themselves beforehand, when they're not making sure that everybody gets some. And Paul even suggests that them improperly doing communion is the reason why they're getting weak, why they're getting ill, and they're even dying as a result of this. That there are some very real physical consequences to improperly taking communion. So now let's move on and talk about tithes and offering. And this is something that most churches do every Sunday, as opposed to communion, which some churches do once a month, once a week, once a year, whatever. Many people doubt the motives of the church and doubt why the church would do this. Many people consider this just, the church panhandling for money. But there is biblical precedence for this. The very idea of presenting offerings to the Lord roots all the way back to Cain and Abel. But if you remember, the reason why Cain was so angry with Abel is because they prepared an offering, gave the offering to the Lord, and then the Lord favored Abel over Cain, because Abel gave a better offering. But we see here that there was an offering being given to the Lord, as if this was a regular occurrence, as if this was just a thing that they did all the time. And of course, this was food and not money, because that's what they used to eat, that they grew their own food then. Unlike today, where money is how we get food. Most of us don't grow our own food. Most of us use money to buy food. The thing is, with presenting offerings like Cain and Abel did, it's directed to the Lord. So what about giving to people? Well, a very early example of this would be Abraham in Genesis 14:17-24, because he just got done saving a lot from a band of armies, and he's got all these spoils of war, and he meets up with this dude named Melchizedek, who's a priest of God, and Melchizedek blesses Abraham, and Abraham gives him a tenth of all of the spoils of war. And this is where we get the idea of tithing 10%, because Abraham here gives a tithe of 10% to Melchizedek. So he's directly supporting a priest of the Lord rather than just giving it to the Lord himself. And this idea of giving it to a religious leader is also presented in 1 Corinthians 9:6, because Paul in this section of Corinthians is complaining about the rights of apostles. And he implies here that they have a right to refrain from work being supported by their ministry. That he, as an apostle, has a right to be supported by the churches he's ministering to. Not that he fully takes up that right, because we see in Corinth, when Paul goes there, he's a tent maker, that he's making his own living. But he's saying here in Corinthians that if he wanted to, absolutely could have been supported by them. But he chose not to be. And we see this in many different ways today. Like, we see many pastors being fully supported by the church, making the whole livelihood off of the ministry, being supported by the church completely. And then we have ministers who get other jobs. And a lot of that is because what the church offers is not enough for them to live off of, so they need to get another job in order to survive. And then we also see people like Rick Warren, who made a fortune selling his books, then wrote a check to his church for every penny they ever paid him, and then refused to get paid again after that. So he's fully being on his own with his finances, rather than being supported by his ministry. And all three are fully acceptable. Because, again, there is a right here cited by Paul that he can refrain from work in order to fully engage in his ministry, instead of trying to balance both things. Right, so what about supporting institutions rather than specific people? Because nowadays we don't really support specific people very often, but we give to a church. So what biblical evidence is there for that? Well, I would like to cite Jesus' parable of the widow giver in Mark 12:41-44, because we see here that it is a common practice to be giving tithes to the temple. We see both the rich man and the widow giving tithes, as if it's a regular thing that they're doing. And it's not like they're giving food products or whatever else like that. No, they're giving money. That's actual financial giving, like we see in the church today. Now, this would easily translate. Some of it went to sustain the building. Things like keeping the lights on in the church, making sure everybody's getting fed, make sure the employees are being paid. Because there's a lot of employees that go into a church. There's worship leaders, there's ministers, there's people who clean the church, and all other kinds of stuff that's going on. So that money is supporting other ministries and missionaries that the church is supporting, as well as many charities that they're supporting as well. And so that money isn't as much of a, hey, we want more money, but it's either help us to do these things, help us to keep the lights on, help us to pay our staff, help us to support these ministries. Because that's the biggest thing that I want to point out there, is that churches today are using a portion of that money to serve other ministries, to give financially to missionaries that they support. That they're taking the money that you're offering them and giving to God, and they're plugging that back into other ministries. Because it's a way for us to give to God, and God is using that money to support His ministries on earth. And so I don't really have a moral of the story today, because these are things that most of us are commonly practicing. But the whole point of today was explaining why we do these things, both as a reminder for those of us who are regularly doing it, but also for those that stumble upon this video that have never done it and are just curious why we do these things in the church, and explaining to them and helping them to understand why we do these things. This is one of those things that we're like, hey, we do this all the time. Everybody knows what we're doing. We don't need to explain it. But then someone new comes in and nobody explains it to them because, everybody already assumes that everybody knows. And then they'll feel stupid if they're trying to ask someone. And so here's the explanation. So This is part 10 of Basics in Theology. I'm surprised we got this far, frankly. We've been kind of on a downward hill, and then we've gone back up as of the past few videos, and I'm very happy about that. Very excited. I feel less and less like I'm just screaming into the void out here. I'm also very thankful to all of you that sit down and watch this every week. I really do appreciate you guys, and feel free to leave a comment whether you think I missed something or whether you just want to say hi, because every comment just absolutely makes my day. And as always, stay safe, friends, and may the Lord be with you.